As many of you know, we support missionaries and humanitarian service organizations all over the world. And 10, 11% to up to 15 to 19% even some months goes out the door immediately. So what you give, a good percentage of that goes to humanitarian service organizations and missionaries around the world. And today we're privileged to have Ben and Hannah Picton with us.
Nice. Thanks, Pastor HL, for having us here today at Daylight. Yeah, my name is Ben. This is my wife, Hannah. And we have 3 kids as well in the back, Penelope, Oliver, and Clara. We are, we call it Global Workers in Central Asia. And so we call it like a sensitive area. We have, sensitive visa. So, after service, you'd like to come to our table, we'd love to chat with you. And hand you one of these cards. Here we go. So we have these little cards here. These are just little cards you can take, and just as a reminder to pray for us. We're overseas for our ministry, for the people we're serving. And there's also a QR code here you can scan and just kind of get on our Facebook group and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I want to share a scripture with you. It's Romans 10, 14, and 15. Maybe you've heard it before. But it's, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? So basically what this verse is saying is, how can people call on Jesus? How can people believe in Jesus if they never even have a chance to hear, if they never have a chance to know him? And how can people go unless they're sent? And so we are an example of people that are sent because, believe it or not, 42% of the world's population still falls into this category where most of them will never have a chance to encounter a believer in Christ or to hear the good news of Jesus. And so that is why we go. We are compelled to go to this place in Central Asia because they're 99.9% Muslim. Most of them will live and die without ever hearing the gospel story, without ever having a chance to hear the hope of Jesus. And that really breaks our hearts because we know what Jesus has done for us. We know that he's healed so much of our brokenness. He's healed our wounds. He's still healing our wounds. And he is a good, kind God. And what we discovered in the hundreds of conversations we've had with these precious people is that they're walking in darkness. They're living in hopelessness. They're so afraid. And they don't have the hope of Christ that we have. And so that's why we go, because we want to share that with them. We want to share them that there's a living, personal God who loves you, who gave his life for you, and you can have a relationship with him. And so that's why we go. So what we do there is our heart really is just to share the good news, share our faith with people, build relationship, because what we want to see is what we call the indigenous church. So we don't want to go there and say, hey, let's start a church that looks like America, whatever that even means. We want them to know what it means to worship Jesus in their own language, in their own culture, and to discover what it looks like to serve Jesus as a Central Asian. And so that's really our heart when we go over there. And so when we go back, we are going to have a language school. So we hire locals, we give them good jobs, we pay them well, so that they can teach their heart language or their native language to anyone who wants to learn. And then we also will teach English. A lot of people want to learn English. They want to know how to speak English. It's just a really valuable skill to have in business. And so we're going to teach English, and we're also going to have a free conversation club where anyone at any level of English can come and just share. We can teach them. We can practice English with them. But it's really just a good way to be in the community, to build community, to meet people, to have those relationships. And it's a really great way just to share life and to share the heart of Jesus with them. And so that is what we're hoping to do when we go back. There's a few ways that you can help us. You can, like Ben said, pray for us. We need your prayers. We believe that prayer changes things. Another way is we are sent by the local church. We have to raise our funds to go back. So maybe you can never go overseas, but if you're really interested in what we're doing, you can partner with us financially to send us over there, just to keep us over there. So we need that too. That's just the reality of what we do. And then the last thing is you can come with us. If you're like, I love Central Asia, or I love sharing what Jesus has done for me with other people, we need help. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of people that have never met a Christian, that have never encountered the good news. And so that's who we are. Please come visit us at the table. We'd love to share more, answer all your questions. We're totally open books. So thank you so much for having us again. We're really honored to be here with you this morning. Thank you.
So most of you know I've been on sabbatical for the month of August, and I've had a lot of time to think about this sermon and a lot of heaviness weighing on me. And today we're going to talk about my favorite topic and yours, which is not love. It's me. Let's hope so. Not so much nowadays. It's uncommon for me to get in the pulpit and feel like I need to preemptively apologize for my sermon, but I kind of feel that way today. It's just going to be weird. I'm going to tell my story. Some of you have heard my story in certain ways, but I'm going to tell it from a different angle today. Of course, we're going to get into love. It's kind of a given around here that we're going to talk about love at some point, and we're going to continue with the FOAS, the father of all sermons, which is the Last Supper discourse of Jesus. Now, there are times when we dive into the text of the Last Supper discourse of Jesus and we parse out the words in the original language and talk about what it means and put it into context. And today I'm not doing that, and at least I'm honest about it. I'm just using the text as a springboard to talk about what I want to talk about. And like I said, at least I'm being honest about it. But let's start with the text. John chapter 15. Jesus is gathered with his friends before the crucifixion. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other. We've talked a lot about love in here recently. In the Last Supper discourse, Jesus doubles down and triples down on love being the only command that matters. And we've defined love as agapate, which most of us know as agape or agape sort of love. We've talked about how in many Christian circles that's kind of a stoic type of love, that as long as I sacrifice, then I've met the qualifications. But we've discovered that the Greeks would not have read it that way. They would have built affection into it. So we've redefined it as strong affection or attachment, denoting preference, value, esteem, or high regard that promotes self-sacrificial giving. We've talked about how hard that is, because Jesus says things like, love your enemies. And so if you embrace this stoic sacrificial love, yeah, I can take a bullet for my enemy. I can do the right things for my enemies, but can I feel affection for my enemies? Can I feel a preference for my enemies? Can I grant esteem to my enemies? And it's a hard thing, and that's why we've described it as a bestowed type of love. It's a love that is impossible for us to conjure up, but God grants through his Holy Spirit. We'll get back to the topic of love later, but I want to start my story, and I want to talk about 3 times in my teen years that I encountered what I'm going to call the modern day gospel. And it'll be clear what I'm talking about as we go. The first was at a Baptist youth camp for troubled children. I was probably 13 or 14. There were 2 orphans in my Lutheran church growing up that I'm going to call John and Jane. And John and Jane had been given to this camp for troubled kids. And it was in Arkansas or Alabama, I don't remember, one of the A states down south. And my family and I had gone to visit them, and we had played basketball that evening at this gymnasium, and we played basketball. And I remember Jane pulled me aside and pulled me to a stairwell outside the basketball gym and shared her version of the gospel with me. And it was the first time I'd ever heard it expressed quite the same. She said, basically, you're a sinner. The cussing you do, the drinking you've done has got you on a road to hell. And unless you ask Jesus in your heart, you're going to go to hell. And that was my first exposure to kind of an evangelical sort of winning people to Jesus, sort of born-again type mentality when it comes to preaching and teaching. And I embrace a lot of those things, but this was my first exposure to it, was you're bad, you're going to hell, unless Jesus saves you from his own wrath, because he died for you. If you will ask him into your heart, you'll be saved. You'll be saved from hell, Not saved to anything, but saved from something. So I remember we were in a mobile home on that camp that night. And it was low ceilings and bunk beds. And I was in the top bunk of a low ceiling bunk bed. And the stucco ceiling was about this far from my face. There was about 18 inches between the top of the bed and the ceiling. And I remember staring up at that stucco ceiling with tears streaking down my face, crying, saying, I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to go to hell. Please save me from hell. Jesus, save me from hell. That's the first time in my life I remember praying what many would call the sinner's prayer. I'm bad. Help me. I don't want to go to hell. My second exposure, I was probably 16 years old. I was dating a girl, and she had invited me to see a Mike Warnke concert. I don't know if you guys remember Mike Warnke, but Mike Warnke was a famous Christian celebrity, a comedian who supposedly was an ex-Satanist and a leader of a coven of witches. And he also did comedy, which was kind of weird, but he was a very funny guy, very gifted speaker. He wrote a book called The Satan Seller, where he described his exploits in the military and exploits as a satanic priest and all the human sacrifices that went on and how the devil's out to get you and he's trying to drag you to hell and Jesus is going to save you from hell. And his sermon that day was along those lines. He'd make the crowd laugh for a long time, but then he'd get down to business. And he'd talk about how your bad deeds are dragging you to hell and Jesus is the salvation for you. And so I remember standing at the altar call and saying, I don't want to go to hell. And I remember reaching my hand to my girlfriend and kind of coercing her to stand with me. And I've always felt bad about that moment. Like she stood, but was it because I did that or not? But they had us pray a prayer that basically was the typical sinner's prayer, Lord, I'm a sinner, come into my life, save me. As it turns out, he was an absolute con artist and not anything that he described. It came out later that he was not a satanic priest. I don't even know if he was in the military. He was just a con man. But he was my second exposure to that type of gospel, and I had the same kind of response. I don't want to go to hell. Therefore, I will do whatever formula you want to avoid going to hell. The third, and probably the most monumental, and probably the worst of my exposure was one of my first days in college. There were signs all over campus about a campus ministry with a campus minister that said, call me anytime, day or night, Jesus is Lord, and this campus minister's phone number. And so I called it. And the first thing out of my mouth, he answered the phone. It was like 11:30 at night. I mean, it was late. But he said, call anytime, day or night. And I was haunted by this hell thing. I was haunted by eternal conscious torment. And I called him and I said, I'm afraid I'm going to hell, and I just wanted you to pray for me. Well, he came knocking on my door within a half an hour, my dorm room. And he basically told me, yes, you are going to hell, but if you will do X, Y, and Z, you can avoid hell through the power of Jesus. That was a catalyst for a lot of life changes for me. But the pattern was set. It was this pattern of you ought to have this colossal, world-changing, world-shaping fear inside of you of this God who wants to melt your eyes and then restore your eyes and then melt your eyes again. That's the gospel that I was introduced to, which is ironic because gospel literally means good news. But it was the gospel of a God who would burn you. Now, it was also the gospel supposedly of a God who loves you, and it was implied that if you lived right, he would rescue with his loving kindness, and you could be a world changer. This is a clip from the video, which is from Shiny Happy People, which is a new documentary that's just come out about teen mania. And there's a lot of good, this is the heaviness that I feel today. There's a lot of good stuff that happened through a lot of that stuff. Even Mike Warnke, we're doing some research on him. There's people who say their life was changed forever because they responded to an altar call at Mike Warnke concert. So it's confusing and convoluted, but I'm talking about my journey and the impact it had on me. And I was committed to being a world changer at that point because people were going to burn. And so I became an advocate of the gospel of Jesus with brass knuckles. I've used this picture before. It's Angry Jesus. AI produced this for me. It's just brilliant. Palm Sunday, Angry Jesus with brass knuckles. I became a warrior fighting against hell. My entire life mission became about saving people from the flames of an angry God. it's my opinion that the concept and the theological belief of eternal conscious torment is a blight on Christianity and a stain on the character of God, because it paints God as the worst kind of abuser. And here's what's really fascinating in a sick sort of way. When you believe in a God who is an abuser, because if you really get down and dirty and think about eternal conscious torment, we're not talking about temporary purgation. We're talking about forever pain. It is the worst kind of abuse for a God who could end it. And here's what happened to me. Here was my experience. When you come to embrace a God who is abusive, you're willing to tolerate all kinds of abuse from those who supposedly represent him. So my life with this campus minister ended up being a lot of spiritual abuse, emotional and mental abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And when you're trying to appease a wrathful, abusive God, it wouldn't surprise you that his representative would be abusive. And so there was a correlation there between my experiences with this hellfire God and the abuse that I experienced. All because of that phone call that started with, "I'm scared I'm going to hell." So I made it my mission to rescue people from hell. So here's how I spent my college years. I did surveys. Every day, this college student, a sophomore in college, every day would be in the student center with a clipboard and surveys about Jesus that started with questions like, what do you believe about heaven? What do you believe about hell? Do you know your Bible very well? What do you believe about abortion and same-sex relationships and drinking alcohol? And do you know if the book of Romans is in the Old Testament or the New Testament? And it was all to funnel people down to this one question that says, do you know what would happen if you died today? That was the goal of the survey. So this sophomore in college, that in my opinion now could have been living his life in many different ways and ought to be living a different way, was kind of harassing people every day to ask them the question, what would happen if you die? Because you're probably going to hell, and I have the answers. I cried about my dad because my dad died when I was 10 years old, and I was convinced he never prayed to receive Jesus. And so I was convinced that he was burning in hell forever, and it really, really bothered me. This is the kind of trauma, this is the fruit of the teaching of eternal damnation like that. I poked, prodded, and drove away my friends. Of course, I was pretty intolerable in those days. And when my friends finally kind of labeled me as intolerable and separated from me, I viewed that as persecution that I was worthy of. I was thankful for the worthiness to be persecuted by my friends because of the gospel of Jesus, which in my words was not, I wouldn't describe now as good news. It was bad news of a wrathful God that needed saving from. I named my dog Witness. Witness was the best dog of all dogs. She spoke English, I guarantee it. I could sit in my bedroom and say, Witness, go get me a towel from the bathroom, and she would go fetch a towel from the bathroom and bring it to me. She was just a phenomenal companion and amazing friend. But I named her Witness, making a commitment to Jesus that I would never tell anyone her name when they asked without witnessing to them. So here's how it would go. I'd be on campus, oh, that's a beautiful dog, what's her name? And I'll say, well, I was so obnoxious. I'd say, I'll tell you, but first I have to tell you a story, can I? And they would say, sure. And I wouldn't even tell a story, I'd just start with all of us are selfish, and our selfishness is leading us down a path of destruction. And Jesus died to save us from that destruction. See how obnoxious that is? Somebody says, what's the name of your dog? And I corner them, trying to shame them, convince them that they're bad and that they deserve hell. It's so humiliating at this point in my life. I wrote a book called God's Greatest Passion, Every Christian Everywhere Sharing Jesus, which basically talked about this kind of list of stuff you could do to share the gospel with Jesus, and I define the gospel as saving people from hell. Bringing people to a point of decision of, will you accept or reject Jesus? And depending on your answer, will you go to heaven or will you go to hell? I wrote another book. I traveled and I taught. I taught things like role plays. I would do this in front of pretty large crowds. Role plays on an airplane, how to strike up a conversation with the person next to you, lead them down a path of a spiritual conversation that eventually got to that all-important question, where will you spend eternity? That's how, if I got on an airplane, you can bet I was going to talk to the person next to me, and I was going to try to keep them from going to hell, because this hell thing had been so deeply wrapped up in the neurons of my brain. I argued. There's nothing wrong with a good argument. I think people need to argue more than they do. But I argued from the perspective of, I have all the answers for your salvation. And by salvation, I didn't mean thriving as you were designed to thrive. I meant not going to hell and going to heaven. I held signs on street corners. My favorite was one that said, "Give up selfishness, follow Jesus." One of my favorites that I would probably still hold today that I find pretty clever was standing in the Las Vegas Strip with a sign that says, "God knows what happens in Vegas." I think that's pretty dang good, you got to admit. I went on mission trips. These missions, so I support missions. We have missionaries today that I got in front of you guys, and I warned them that my sermon was going to be weird. I believe in missions. But when I went on mission trips, it wasn't about light and darkness. It wasn't about life versus death. It wasn't about thriving versus decaying or anything like that. It was about going to hell to burn forever versus harps and angels on clouds. It wasn't about building water wells for thirsty people or feeding hungry souls or visiting prisoners, unless those things were subsidiary to bringing people to that point of decision. I street preached. I read The Master Plan of Evangelism, which is really still, in my opinion, a good book. But it was the idea of disciples replicating disciples. And so the disciples that I would produce, and as I honestly look back, doing all these surveys, street preaching, handing out tracts, striking up conversations on planes, there were really amazing moments where I would still say God showed up in those conversations. So God worked in spite of me, as opposed to because of me a lot of times, in my opinion. But Jesus talks about the blind leading the blind, creating disciples of people who shouldn't have disciples. And in some sense, when I enacted the master plan of evangelism of creating disciples, I was just replicating myself, and I had a very skewed view of what God was like, and there's a lot of ugliness there. I played a demon in Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. Oh, sorry, I skipped The Way of the Master. The Way of the Master is Ray Comfort's ministry, and I went out street preaching and handing out tracts and witnessing with people with Ray Comfort at one point in Dallas, Texas. And his whole ministry is about bringing people to believe that they are adulterous, thieving, murderous, adulterers, and lying thieves. That's the goal of his systematic approach to sharing the gospel with people, is bringing people to that consciousness. And I went out with great joy to be among this Christian celebrity that made that his life mission. Like I said, I was a demon in Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, a production that's exactly what I'm describing. People either go to heaven or hell, depending on whether they accept Jesus into their hearts or not. I started my own gospel tract business, and I saw this all as world-changing. I saw it as my mission to save people. I was a world changer 2000, which is like the Terminator, but a little bit different. I sang the song History Maker from Delirious, which says, I'm going to be a history maker in this land. And I really believed I'm going to be a speaker of truth to all mankind. And that truth was, you are selfish, your selfishness will lead you to hell, but God can rescue you from your selfishness by making you born again. And you don't have to go to hell, you go to heaven. This was my life verse. Habakkuk 1:5. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I've thought many times about having that tattooed on my forearm as a permanent reminder that God is going to do something great through H.L. Hussman, something so mind-blowing that even if he told me about it, I wouldn't believe him. Never mind the fact that when this passage was written, it was about the Babylonians being used as judgment against the Israelites. It was something so bad is going to happen that you wouldn't believe it if I told you. But I embraced it, I reappropriated it, and Paul actually reappropriates it later to talk about Jesus. So reappropriation is fine. I think it's important to have verses that are meaningful in your life. But I reappropriated it as God is going to use me in ways that I never dreamed because I've got this message, this speaker of truth to all mankind about hell. And hell was the foundation, it was. I'm not saying it's the foundation for everyone that talks about the gospel, which begs the question of if you believe in it, why isn't it? But that's another question for another day. Isaiah 49 was another one of my passages. It says, "Listen to me, you islands. Hear me, you distant nations. Before I was born, the Lord called me. From the time of my birth, he has made mention of my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will display my splendor." I conveniently left out Israel and plugged in HL. You're my servant. Your mouth is a sharpened sword. From the time you were born, I have called out your name as a purveyor of truth. I was a world changer. Being a world changer meant rescuing people from hell and God's wrath. And like I said, it wasn't supplying water. It wasn't feeding hungry people. It wasn't rescuing captives, fighting against racial tension, touching the lives of the outcast, unless those things were subsidiary to the message of get people saved. I brought a copy of my book with me, and I'm not going to read it right now, but there's an excerpt in it where there's a chapter called Service Evangelism. And in that chapter, there's a quote that says basically, service, I'm paraphrasing, service isn't really serving anyone unless it leads people to heaven and rescues them from hell. You can feed all the hungry people you want. You can give water to the thirsty. You can give clothes to the... And what's really fascinating about that chapter is I started with the parable of the sheep and the goats, and I retell that story. And I retell it with God pouring out his wrath on people who don't serve others. And I really light it up. I mean, his flaming eyes pierced the crowd, and because that was my perspective on God in those days. This is where my sabbatical comes in, because I'm feeling the weight of this life and where it goes from here. And I have 9 minutes to sum up a whole lot of stuff, and I'm going to hurry. I have rejected eternal conscious torment. I believe it's a blight and an abomination in the Christian church now. I think it opens the door for great abuse. I don't believe in it now, which doesn't say I don't believe in hell or purgation or cleansing or destruction. It's just I think this concept that people will burn forever in eternal conscious torment is ludicrous. And it is impossible to reconcile with God is love. I don't think you can do it. I think you can do all the mental gymnastics, all the literary gymnastics you want. I don't think it's possible to do. So now, think about the existential crisis in a guy like me that dedicated 25 years and wrote 2 books and traveled the world and taught and started a gospel tract company and harassed people on planes and trains and street corners. Like, it's hard. It's hard for me to come to grips with, and I feel like I've wasted, in some sense, a huge portion of my life. I've embraced a center-set Christology, which we don't have time to go into right now. Google is free. It's your friend. ChatGPT can tell you a lot about center-set Christology, but it's more about trajectory than it is bounded set theology, which is crossing barriers, praying a sinner's prayer, being baptized, being confirmed, praying in tongues, whatever the rule is that says you're on the outside, now you can be on the inside. It's not that anymore. I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but I can just as easily celebrate a single mom pouring cereal for her kids of a morning as I can someone praying a sinner's prayer. I believe Christ is in all and through all and moving in ways that we can't possibly understand, which isn't to say that people shouldn't pray to receive Jesus or ask Jesus into their lives or pray prayers of commitment. It's not to say those things at all. It's just to say that's not that hell is not the guiding principle as to why. And it's not a set of rules anymore. It's about Christ being in all and through all. And then I've come to better understand words. That quote from The Princess Bride, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. It comes through my head a lot when it comes to the New Testament and the New Testament writings. When it comes to love, which is agape, or heaven, which is uranon, or hell, which is Gehenna, or all these different words, forgiveness, wrath, righteousness, which is dikaiosune, sin, which is hamartia, repentance, which is metaneo. These words do not mean what I was led to believe they mean. They mean something different, and they back up a good and loving and merciful God who is kind and compassionate, merciful and just, like the song that we sang. And the concept of eternal conscious torment is antagonistic to that God. And it changes everything. I don't any longer believe that the good news is that you're a sinner in need of salvation that's condemned to hell. And if you ask Jesus into your heart, he will change that and let you go to heaven. It's more Christ is near. Thus love is near, because Christ is God and God is love. They're one and the same. He's close. You want to know him, learn about Christ. Christ represents God. The gospel message is this story. So back to my sabbatical. I got 5 minutes to sum up. Here I am, this world changer, saving people from a hell that I no longer believe in, spending decades and hours, and I want to say I gave my whole life to the cause, but the ironic thing is I still had time to play golf. I still had time to play video games, to go on vacations and eat good food, which is also contradictory to the belief in eternal conscious torment. How can you rest if you believe it? If you really, truly believe it, how could one ever rest? I remember an atheist saying he would walk across Europe on his knees, hands and knees on broken glass to tell one person about it if it was true. But I gave my whole life to it, or at least a huge portion of my life. So now what does it mean to be on the other side of that? I've got this neurological disorder. It's a progressive neurological disease. My time is running out. I've spent all this time on wasted theology. I've poked and prodded friends and ostracized them. I've written books that are utter garbage. I remember taking hundreds of copies of my books and dumping them in a dumpster over at Bowman Field. Like coming to that point that day of saying that's no longer who I am. Now it begs the question of who am I? What do I do? Where do I go from this? And so I'm on a walk with my wife over my sabbatical. This is the route we take from our home. It's about 1.1 miles or 1.2 miles. Sometimes we shoot the breeze. Sometimes we talk about the kids. We talk about dinner. We talk about our upcoming vacation. We talk about whatever. This time I needed to unload. And so I unloaded on her the fact that I was feeling lost, that I feel like I threw away decades of my God-given life. Now I've got this disease that says my time is running out. My worldview and my ministry for so long was grounded in judgmentalism. I used to sit in crowds of people at basketball games and think they're all going to hell. What can I do to help them? I sat and condemned people in my mind constantly. And that was me for a very long time. And so I'm sharing this with my wife. Now, I don't know if you know my wife. My wife is a pretty matter-of-fact broad. Her sisters and I make fun of her because we have this expression, which is comma, dummy. Because so often, something that comes out of her mouth, if you added comma, dummy to the end, the tone would not change. She's a Southern Illinois farm girl, and she talks like a Southern Illinois farm girl sometimes. Now, let me be crystal clear. My wife is the pearl of all pearls and the greatest blessing of my entire life. So I don't want to picture her as some hard-nosed, angry person, because she's not. But we're going to do a bit of call and response here. I'm going to go a couple minutes late today, and I apologize for that, especially since there's chicken wings and hot dogs in the back. I'm sorry, but not sorry. We're going to do a call and response. I'm going to say something, and you're going to add the word dummy to it, okay? It's stuff like this. You left the garage door open all night. So she doesn't actually say dummy, but the tone says dummy. Siler, use a towel. Where's my phone charger? You're getting the picture. So we're on this walk, and I'm pouring out my heart about this downslope of life that I'm on. I feel lost without a mission. I feel like a man who wasted decades. I feel like I did irreversible harm. I judged everyone. I'm expecting compassion. Add the word. She says, I think you know what to do. It was with that tone. She said, I think you know what to do. And it hurt me. I'm expecting that must be really hard. No, that's not what I get. I think you know what to do. And so I was automatically slightly offended and slightly hurt. And I said, tell me. And she said, love God and love the people around you, dummy. She didn't say dummy, but she said it. She said, love God and love the people around you. And then she kept the tone. She said, I mean, that's what you teach people all the time, dummy. So this is what I get from my wife in that conversation. She says, I think you know what to do. Love God and love people. That's what you tell people all the time. And I'm offended. I'm hurt. And so we walk in silence for about 100 yards while I have this epiphany. Man, she's right. I wanted to be hurt, I wanted to be offended, but I needed to hear it, and I needed to hear it in the tone that she said it. Like, man, snap out of it. Get a hold of yourself. You know the answer. Christ is the answer, and Christ is love. Love people, love God, and love the people around you. So I told her I now understand why I keep her around, which is something I say to her all the time. That's why I keep you around. Lots of wisdom poured out of her in that moment. So now I'm on the other side of this thing, and what does missions look like? What is a life? This list of stuff that I used to do, surveys and crying about dad and poking and prodding my friends and having a dog named Witness and writing books and traveling and teaching and arguing and so forth. How can I maintain that zeal but redefine it, redirect it into love? I'll say it like this. I kind of think my life mission is to tell people that hell ain't a thing. Nobody burns in hell forever, nobody. But that's kind of a side point at this point. I want to be just as zealous and just as passionate about a God who is close. It's no longer you're on the outside looking in because you're bad, but Christ will make you good. It's Christ is here. He's close. You are his beloved child. Now walk in that. And it's just a different perspective on, same list, could be. I can cry about destruction. I can cry about addiction. I can cry about loneliness. There's lots to cry about in this world. There's lots to try to correct. There's lots of intervention that can happen. It doesn't change the fact that I want to intervene in people's lives. It changes the definition of God, what God is like and who God is. 1 John says there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Reverence and awe, yes. Concern about cause and effect, absolutely. But cowering in terror, no more. Christ said this. He said, this is my command. Love each other. And I heard it in my wife's voice, dummy.